Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for June 9th, 2023. Let me begin by reminding everyone that tomorrow, Saturday, June 10th, beginning at 10 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, the Schiller Institute will be holding an online conference on the John F. Kennedy's vision of peace. This is a conference where we'll be reviewing on its 60th anniversary the implications of the speech given by John F. Kennedy on June 10th, 1963, in which he made an open appeal to Americans and to the citizens of the Soviet Union to work together for peace, to overcome the differences between them by recognizing the common interests and acting on that. So this is an extremely important event. There'll be some interesting speakers, a lot of material, and I think it's something that after you see it, you'll wish you had told everyone you know to watch it, to find out about this part of American history, which has been largely obliterated from the history book, from the records, because of the assassination of Kennedy and the cover-up afterwards. So Saturday morning, June 10th, 10 a.m. Eastern, at theschillerinstitute.com, and I hope to see you there. Now, it's Friday, so I'm going to take a couple questions, and not surprisingly, some of the questions were on the matter of John F. Kennedy. Many of you wrote, well, wasn't John F. Kennedy part of the establishment? Wasn't he a war hawk? Wasn't he continuously trying to overthrow the Castro regime? He was a cold warrior. What makes you think that there's anything different to Kennedy than that? Well, first of all, let me say there's a lot of documentary evidence that shows that a fundamental shift occurred in Kennedy's thinking following the near nuclear confrontation with the Soviet Union in October 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a moment in history where, had the advisors of Kennedy, the military and intelligence advisors of Kennedy, had their way, we would have ended up in a likely nuclear war with the Soviet Union. Kennedy was able to very significantly intervene against the hawks to shift away from an attack on Cuba, bombing Cuba, into negotiating a deal with Nikita Khrushchev. This is history. It's documented. The whole question of the Cuban Missile Crisis has been explored over and over again, and what we're saying about this is clear. Now, what's not so clear to most people is what happened after that, because Kennedy intended to, after the Bay of Pigs, intended to dismantle the CIA, as he said. He fired its chief, Allen Dulles, who had been the coordinator for the Bay of Pigs. But Kennedy was reevaluating everything from the standpoint of the existential threat of nuclear war. Now, it's not just that he was thinking about these things. He carried out measures to include a dialogue with Nikita Khrushchev, and he had several intermediaries who, including Norman Cousins from the Saturday Review, including networks in the Vatican, including his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, who played that role during the Cuban Missile Crisis with his meetings with Anatoly Dobrynin, the Russian ambassador in Washington. But there are letters, there are testimony from Soviet officials in a number of books, including books on Khrushchev himself, where Khrushchev said he appreciated what Kennedy did. He said the June 10th speech was the greatest speech by an American president since Roosevelt, which means Khrushchev knew that Kennedy was in that Roosevelt tradition, and that Roosevelt intended that there not be a Cold War with the Soviet Union, but that the wartime collaboration could have been continued for the benefit of all people. So if you listen to the speech, you hear something different in Kennedy than you heard when he delivered the Cuban Missile Crisis speech. There's also documentary evidence that he was extending an overture toward Castro, and that several intermediaries were trying to see if they could arrange a discussion with Castro and end the problems that existed of having a communist dictatorship 90 miles away from Florida. So there's a lot of material that's available. Now, why don't people know about this? Well, for the same reason most people don't know about the June 10th speech, because it's been blacked out of history. It's been treated as a rhetorical flourish that has nothing to do with a change in policy. Now, this gets to a second question that I received from a number of people. Do you and Mrs. LaRouche really think hearing a 60-year-old speech can change the United States? Well, hearing the speech in itself isn't going to change anything, except you'll hear a president who clearly had a conception that American policy must change to take into consideration the concerns of the other. What was the key to overcoming the threat of nuclear war over Cuba? It's that Kennedy recognized that Khrushchev had his own hardliners who were pushing him to confront the United States, just as Curtis LeMay and others in the Kennedy Joint Chiefs of Staff and the intelligence community around Dulles were pushing for a confrontation with the Soviet Union. Khrushchev had a similar network. And what Kennedy recognized is that while it was legitimate for the United States to say there should be no foreign missiles planted off the US coast, he also recognized that the Soviets had reason to be opposed to having US missiles, Jupiter missiles, in Turkey. This is a fundamental principle of statecraft, the idea of the principle of Westphalia, that you have to be concerned with the interests of the other, that that's the basis for peace, and that you act toward other countries as you wish they would act toward you. Non-interference, recognition of their legitimacy and their legitimate concerns for security. This was running through Kennedy's mind as he prepared this speech on June 10th. And he followed it up again on September 20th with a very powerful speech at the United Nations, where he emphasized the importance of economic cooperation and development as the basis for peace, and that this was a common concern of all nations. So hearing an American president expressing those views, when we're so used to the cynical lies of the Bushes, the Obamas, the Bidens, as well as despite his language, Trump carried out pretty much the same foreign policy, with the exception of launching new wars, but a belligerence toward other countries. The idea that we can have cooperation, not just with people who kowtow to our demands of the rule-based order, but that people join willingly in support of common aims and common interests. That's what you can get from listening to this speech, and that there was a transformation underway with President Kennedy. That transformation was stopped by an assassin's bullets. Kennedy was not only reviewing the relationship with the Soviets, where he agreed to a nuclear test ban treaty, not only thinking of talking with the Cubans, but of pulling US troops out of Vietnam. At that point, we had what were called special advisors, which was a military force, somewhere over 5,000 people or so. Kennedy wanted to pull 1,000 of them out by the end of 1963, and all of them out. They were drafting a plan to get them all out by the end of 1964. So there's the evidence that this was occurring. You see in the speech a different quality of statecraft that characterized John F. Kennedy. Now, what does that mean for Americans? That was taken from us. It was stolen from us. And we were lied to about what happened. We were lied to about why it happened. We were lied to about the implications of it. Because since 1963, November 22nd, the US has been in a virtual endless war, from Vietnam to our involvement in Afghanistan, which began under Brzezinski's tutelage in 1979. Incidents like Panama, Grenada, 2 wars in Iraq, the Afghan War, numerous undeclared wars in Africa, deployments of troops all over the world. That's the US policy. And it's not about peace, it's about enforcing the rules-based order, which means that every country must agree to submit itself to the demands of the Anglo-American, that is, City of London and Wall Street, financial oligarchy, and their corporate cartels. That has to end. If people can learn of the real history, and not to glibly say the US is the greatest country ever, or the US is the worst country ever, but to understand there's been a war since the middle of the 17th century between an oligarchy centered in the City of London and a small group of Americans who wish to create a city on a hill. And that we've been in war since that time. That's what the two world wars were about. That's what most of the 19th century was about. We've had handfuls of presidents who have rescued us from the British takeover, the takeover of a combination of British ideology, British imperial policy, and so on. So if we learn that history and come to terms with it, we can become a better people, and we can then create better leaders, because the leaders we have right now are a bunch of blind, deaf, and dumb bums who are loyal only to the interests of the corporate cartels that put them in office and not to the people that they have sworn to protect and serve. Final question is, why are you so sure that Russia didn't blow up the dam? Now, there are a couple answers to that. The first is that we've been subjected to an endless string of charges and allegations about Russia, which have never fully been investigated. The so-called Bucha massacre. Well, the Ukrainians wouldn't let anyone in to challenge their narrative on that. The shelling of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. The idea that the Russians are shooting at their own soldiers? Why would they do that? That the Russians launched the drone attack on the Kremlin at the beginning of May. And now the explosion that blew up the Kakhovka Dam, that was done by Russia. Now, just because there's a litany of charges that are, and by the way, the big one, that the Russians were responsible for the destruction of the North Sea pipelines. Now, here's the thing you have to ask yourself. What evidence have you seen of these charges coming from the West? Zelensky, the moment the dam was breached, Zelensky came out and said it's Russia that did it, it's terrorism from Putin, and this must be addressed. Was there an investigation? The BBC, interestingly, today, typically, ran a story about why we know that Russia always lies, because they don't present evidence. Well, did Zelensky present any evidence? Did the State Department present any evidence? When evidence was presented, when a logical and thought-through analysis of the Nord Stream pipelines, for example, was drafted by Seymour Hersh, there have been 3 or 4 different cover stories put out in the major media and by governments to say that it was either Russia, independent divers, a Ukraine operation, when the obvious finger points to the United States. Why has the Congress not demanded an investigation? Why has Chancellor Scholz in Germany not demanded an investigation? So this is what is the meaning of a narrative. You repeat a lie often enough so that if anything bad happens, if your dog gets pregnant, if your garbage cans are turned over, it's Putin. Putin, 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 Russia, Russia, Russia. Speaking of no evidence, what about Russiagate? So we've repeatedly been subjected to these charges with no evidence, and then we're told, well, Russia hasn't produced the evidence. The Russians were not allowed to go down in the North Sea to inspect the pipelines. The Russians are not able to look at the parts of the dam. The Russians are in areas of Ukraine where these things happen. And don't forget the other one, the missile that hit Poland. Zelensky insisted it was Russia. When the evidence came out, did we hear more about how that was a lie from Zelensky on behalf of his puppet masters? So what I'm saying is mostly circumstantial, but you get nothing but that from the Ukraine side. The question then is, who stops these investigations? And it's the West. It's the NATO countries that refuse to allow a full investigation of what happened. Now, if we had honest investigations, we would find out that while there are times where the other side, where the Russians or the Chinese maybe do things that they shouldn't do, what we find instead is a consistent pattern of U.S. interventions, U.S. meddling, U.S. regime change coups, U.S. sponsored color revolutions, U.S. triggered wars and fake flags, false flags. This happens over and over and over. And then we get the fake news from the media to cover for it, I should say. So that's why I'm reasonably certain that the argument that Russia blew up the dam is a fraud, and that in fact it was the Ukrainians, whether it was Zelensky himself who ordered it or some subordinate. But this is where you see why it's essential that you support the LaRouche organization and our websites and the work that we're doing, because we actually do investigations. We look for the truth. We interview people. We're involved on the ground all over the world. And that's what goes into my daily updates. That's what goes into the Executive Intelligence Review daily report every single day, which is something you can subscribe to. So the real question here is, if it means enough to you to ask why this happened, it should mean enough for you to do your own investigation and develop your own critical judgment. And I'm reasonably certain that if you're of sound mind, unlike the President of the United States, you'll be able to reach the conclusions that we have. So thanks for joining me. Don't forget, tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. Eastern, the Vision of Peace of John F. Kennedy. See you there, and then see you next week. Hello, thanks for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our videos. Support our independence to produce videos like these. Become a member of the LaRouche organization at thelarouche.org/member. By becoming a member for $25 or more, you'll get special access to the EIR Alert Daily Briefing and Weekly Magazine, which is what I read to stay on top of things.